Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. I told you I'd be back with questions asked, questions answered. So I'm going to be filming two videos. This will be the first. This is actually part two. And then I'll do part three afterwards because I got a lot more questions after part one, surprisingly. And I found a few on Facebook that I forgot and that I already answered. So I figured I'd just throw it all into a third video. So let's just get started. Let's get started with the second one. I have 6 questions, okay? So I will try to get through these. And if you ever have any questions for me, if you follow me on Instagram or you want to leave a comment on YouTube, by all means, ask away. And maybe I'll make another video. So the first question, I need my glasses for this because I'm looking down at the questions. First question is, what do you prefer? Collecting silver, gold, bronze, copper? What kind of what age do you prefer collecting? Well, as much as I like Golden Age, I still consider myself a Silver Age collector. I like Bronze Age, and I do like some Copper Age stuff, even some modern stuff. But I've always felt at heart that I am a Silver Age collector, despite trying to fill some EC gaps and wanting to get a couple other Golden Age books here and there. My focus, if you look at my collection, once you sort out all that filler that I've collected over the years, even when I first started collecting back in the early 90s, once you sort all of that out, you see that my collection is mainly Silver Age Marvel. There's some Silver Age DC, of course, and there's a decent amount of Bronze Age stuff, but I'm more of a Silver Age collector. All right, that's honestly what I prefer. You know, as much as I would like to get into Golden more, you know, as for those of you that watch my channel, I collect EC horror, and I'm even thinking about getting into some EC sci-fi. But despite that, there are a lot of other Golden Age books out there, in particular Golden Age horror books, pre-code horror books that I would just simply love to get into. However, you know, as a collector, I guess I consider myself mainly a superhero collector. So for me to go into those pre-code books, it's almost like another full-time job in the hobby. You know, it's collecting a lot of the pre-code horrors or even Golden Age books and wanting to still get a decent amount of Silver Age books. It's just too much on the wallet, you know, because some of those pre-code horrors, and I see so many great pre-code horror books on Instagram by some of the people I follow, they are super expensive, and I'm talking super expensive for even the lowest of grades. So as much as I would love to get into Golden, I wish I had more Golden. I'm mainly a Silver Age collector, and I'm happy with being a Silver Age collector. I really do enjoy my Marvel superhero books. I like Bronze Age too, but I'm mainly into Silver. Second question, who is your favorite artist? I've answered this question a couple of times over the years. My favorite artist is Graham Ingels. He was mainly famous for doing EC books, EC horror, in particular The Haunt of Fear. He's my favorite. If I had to go down a list off the top of my head, I know I probably mentioned this in another video, but off the top of my head, while I'm on EC, I would have to say Johnny Craig is my second favorite from EC. There's a real contrast, you know, between the two artists. You have Graham Ingels that draws a more of a gothic style, a lot of sloppy, dripping, disgusting looking zombies and people for that matter. Whereas Johnny Craig is very, you know, middle class, clean type of artwork. So there's a contrast between the two. But I still think Graham Ingels is my favorite. But if I had to throw just one more in my pool of favorites, with Graham Ingels being at the top, I would have to say Todd McFarlane's up there too. And there's a question coming up that actually no, I think I'll talk about it now while I'm on artists and all that, about Todd McFarlane. for me, Todd McFarlane, Wade Graham Ingalls, he really symbolizes EC horror for me. And so does Johnny Craig to a lesser extent. But it's mainly Graham Ingalls, and that's why he's my favorite artist. But I have to give credit to Todd McFarlane too, because outside EC, my favorite superhero is Spider-Man. And of course, I like the X-Men almost directly under Spider-Man. Not that much of a gap between the two. But Spider-Man, I think, comes out on top over X-Men for me. And in addition to liking stories and all that stuff, we take a look at the art. As comic collectors, we like to look at the artwork as well. And Todd McFarlane was the artist that really brought me into Spider-Man. I know some people, when they think of Spider-Man, especially early Spider-Man, the character is synonymous with Steve Ditko art. For some, it's John Romita. I've always preferred Steve Ditko over John Romita, but despite all of that, I prefer Todd McFarlane over the both of them. I know that might be fighting words for a lot of people. Well, to each his own, right? But I say Todd McFarlane because I thought that he drew Spider-Man so well with the webbing, and he drew the villains and the backgrounds and all these other things that I really pay attention to. I think we all pay attention to. He drew those things so well. And he really, even though Spider-Man is a success at Marvel, with or without Todd McFarlane, there's no doubt about it. Spider-Man, I think, is Marvel's most popular character, no matter what you feel about the Fantastic Four being the first Marvel family and all that other stuff. First Marvel superhero team. Regardless of that, Spider-Man always comes out on top, I think, above all others. And so he'll always be popular, like I said, with or without Todd McFarlane. But I think it was when Todd McFarlane took over in the mid to late 80s, it's almost like he reinvented Spider-Man without actually doing a retcon of Spider-Man storyline, as we so often see today in the modern age, or in the variant age, as Nick would call it. So I have to give credit to Todd McFarlane, even though Graham Ingalls is my favorite, and I spent more time talking about Todd McFarlane. So maybe there's a new contender for the top. All right, but I just wanted to give you my reasons for that, why I think the way I do. Number 3. What got you into comics? Tales from the Crypt got me into comics. I remember watching the premiere of the show, the first season, back in 1989. I've always, I've always liked those sort of horror stories. And when Tales from the Crypt came out, it was advertised. It was something that I liked, that looked interesting to me, and I watched it, and I really got into it. It was only first 6 episodes, and then it came back full force with season 2, which was probably the best season. Seasons 2 and 3 were both very good, but I think season 2 edges out just a little bit higher than season 3, but both produced some wonderful episodes with some really great guest stars and all of that. But it was Tales from the Crypt, and I realized that, wow, these were comics? And then I went looking for them, and I found them in reprint form in the early 90s. Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear, they were always being reprinted back then. And the first reprints that I became aware of were the Gladstone reprints. And I know there's Gemstone, I think, right after that. Sometimes those two get a little confused, but it was the Gladstone double issue series. I think there were only 6 issues for each title. That's what really got me into comics. But it was the X-Men that made me a comic book collector. But without Tales from the Crypt, I wouldn't have gotten into comics, I don't think. Number 4. What was the best comic book you bought? I'm prepared for this one. The best comic book I bought, right here. I don't think anybody could deny it. Okay? So a 2.0, but it's a nice looking 2.0, but it's all mine. That was the best comic book decision I ever made. That was the best book I ever bought, and I don't think it's ever going to be topped. I mean, how could you top it? I mean, sure, you can buy some really cool Golden Age books, but only thing that could top an Amazing Fantasy for me would most likely be a Batman #1 or one of those big books, which is not going to happen anytime soon. But that's okay, because I have the first appearance of Spider-Man. And I traded a bunch of things for it. I sold a couple of things for it. And I would say about 75% of the things that I either sold or traded, I got back. And there's maybe about 15% of that left that I probably will never get back. And the rest, eventually I will get back that I didn't get yet. So I think I did pretty well with getting the Amazing Fantasy, especially now. But I remember, before I go on to the next question, I remember about 2 years ago, Amazing Fantasy was softening up. And I remember watching videos and hearing people talk about, oh yeah, you should sell it, get rid of it, and all that stuff. And then no one could have predicted the pandemic and the spike in prices today. And I just don't see fantasy and some of those other big Silver Age books going down a whole lot whenever this subsides, whenever it does, if it does, whatever. I don't have any predictions on that really, if it's going to or whatnot. But I don't think that fantasy is going to go down that much, or at least to where it was 2 or 3 years ago. I think those days are over. But I still can't get over some of the people telling me to sell Amazing Fantasy. Oh, well, you can get rid of it and all that stuff. I'm like, oh, God, give me a break. Yeah, no one's going to want to buy an Amazing Fantasy, so let me try to get rid of this ASAP. I don't think so. I've always had faith in that book. I never doubted it. Spider-Man, I think, is one of the most popular comic book characters of all time. He's up there with Superman and Batman. Where he is when it comes to those others, I don't know. Some people may say he's the third, with Superman being at the top, Batman being underneath Superman and above Spider-Man. But no matter what, I think he's the top 3 superheroes of all time. So if you have an Amazing Fantasy, whether it's a 2.0 like me or a 4.0 or even a 0.5, I think you've done well. Number 5, 2 more questions, including this one. Number 5, what was your greatest comic book accomplishment? Well, it was Amazing Fantasy 15, but maybe I should change that question around a bit. I'll change it to something like, well, what was one of your most favorite comic book accomplishments? Now, outside the fantasy, because I just gave you why I love Amazing Fantasy and Spider-Man was probably one of my favorite characters of all time. But aside from all that, I've always wanted to try to finish a couple of runs. Now, what I consider a run in comic books is probably different than what other people consider a run. For me, one of the runs that I wanted to complete was my X-Men Silver Age run, which is issues 1 through 66. I've always wanted to complete my Tales from the Crypt run, which I consider starts at Crime Patrol 15, which is the introduction of the Crypt Keeper and the Crypt of Terror, all the way to the last issue of Tales from the Crypt, which is number 46. So I would say some of my favorite comic book accomplishments were completing those runs. And on top of that, especially with X-Men, even at Tales from the Crypt 2, I've managed to keep a certain condition in those books. I mean, my X-Men #1 is a 3.0, so that's pretty low, but it's still pretty good too. But all the other books are mostly above 5.5, which is still a mid-grade book. That's nothing stellar. It's nothing like, oh, this is an 8 or a 9.4 or a 9.2 or anything like that. But they're still very good-looking books and not bad for books that are over 50 years old. And I could say the same thing for Tales from the Crypt. I still have a few that need to be upgraded that are below a 4.0. But most of them, except for maybe 3, because I recently upgraded one about a month or 2 ago, are all above 4.0, right up to maybe a 7. Not too many 7s. They're mainly in the 5 to 5.5 range, with a healthy amount in the 4 to 4.5 range. I think that's great. They're very presentable and meaningful and beautiful. So I would say those are some of my favorite comic book accomplishments. And the last question for this video, what was the best Comic-Con you've ever been to? without even thinking, I would say hands down, the New York Comic Con 2014. It was phenomenal. It was my very first New York Comic Con. I've been to a bigger con earlier in the year where I met Chris Claremont. But before that, I've only been to small local cons that are in hotel ballrooms, uh, you know, church halls, and things of that nature. So, although I went to a decent sized con, I think it was in either April or May before the New York Comic Con, which is always in October, I would still say, even years later, New York Comic Con 2014 was phenomenal. It was such a wonderful experience. I went with my friend Brian, which was fun because he's into obviously comics and illustrations and all those sort of wonderful things. But just being able to come up with a list of books that I wanted to get, going to that con and getting every single book on that list, plus a couple that I just didn't anticipate, is just memorable and fantastic in and itself. Okay, I got my very first Golden Age book there, which was Vault of Horror 16. You know, as much as I liked the EC books for all those years, never had one. And when I got one, it started to awaken the EC collecting monster inside me, and it served me well, you know, when it comes to my collecting. But that convention was just awesome. It was just awesome. I remember, I've said this before in other videos, the book that I wanted to get above all else was Primer #2, which was the first appearance of Grendel. I was coming back to the hobby, and I was, you know, obviously wanted to get books that I've always wanted, but I said, you know, there are other books I've always wanted that I sort of forgotten about. Characters that are not in the mainstream with Marvel and DC that I wanted to get. And Grendel was at the top of that list. Hellboy was there too. I wanted to get some Spawn stuff. And Image is the third big company, but I still look at it as an outsider compared to Marvel and DC. So it was just a wonderful experience. I had such a great time going there, and I was never able in the years that followed, despite getting whatever great books or what have you, I was never able to replicate that wonderful time I had in 2014. I remember in 2015, which was one of my best years in my personal life. I do have a life outside comics and games. 2015 and 2016 were two of my most favorite years of my life. So, naturally, probably the Comic-Con added to that, right? Your personal life and have your hobby life come together? Not really. 2015, I remember comic-wise, hobby-wise, New York Comic-Con-wise, was very disappointing. I was like, it didn't have the same spark as it did last year. So long story short, too late, it was New York Comic-Con 2014. And you can still watch that video on my channel. So thank you for watching. I'm going to film the next part of this immediately after it, but I'll release it sometime later. And who knows, maybe by the time that one releases, by the time part 3 releases, I'll have a part 4 in the works. Maybe I will. So if you have any questions, by all means ask. All right? Thanks for watching, everybody, and be safe.